All right. Excuse me. Hey guys, welcome to the daily word verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we continue. Actually, we are in a brand new study, Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to study the Gospels. Um, and the Gospels are God's um, the Gospels are God's record of Jesus, and it's kind of interesting
We
because
continue.
it is God's record, not man. God is giving us a record, a story, a revelation of what He wants us to know concerning His Son. Um, and that's important because you will run into people who will question you. Some Christians are a little less. They don't like to engage people. It's just kind of another, you can say, topic. Jesus, you're going to see Jesus engage people all the time, and people got frustrated with him. People got frustrated with um, um, the apostles in their defense of the gospel. Today, Christians are a little intimidated when people challenge them. Um, but that was a little rant. But anyway, it is something, again, my point is that people will engage you about the gospel. We should not be afraid. And I think we also should really kind of concentrate on reading and understanding the narrative in which God gave, not man. And so I hear all the time on different news, media, people telling their version of Jesus. And so, for example, you will hear people say, Jesus was a good man, you know, um, and he told his followers to give all their money away and give it all to the poor. And that's not what Jesus said at all. That's why, again, when we study the actual Gospels, we're going to be very, very surprised. Also, let me say this, the gospel message, the gospel, and especially as we come to Matthew, as I said, that Matthew, each gospel is telling a particular perspective, a narrative, as they were led by the Holy Spirit. Now think about that for a moment when we say that if I was there, right? If I was one of the original apostles, or if I was like in the case of Luke and Mark, you could say they were secondhand, right, witnesses. So what would you write about Jesus if you was to sit down and say, I'm going to write something about the Lord, I'm going to, write my experience? What would you write? Okay, now the reason why I say that is because the apostles didn't write what they probably would want to have wrote. Okay, that they wrote as they were led by the Holy Spirit, um, unction, right, inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so God wanted us to see this. By the way, when we look at this gospel, you can say, look at the word gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So as we're studying Matthew, we are actually studying what we could say a logos. We're going to come to that word much later. We've talked about this word before. That if you were to travel back through time, you would travel past the material universe, you would run into God. Now this is so you if you can go back in time, and for that matter, if you even go out, even now, if you are able to go beyond the experiences of the material, the physical, the excuse me, the human experience. If you are able to travel out as far as out is, you would run into God, because all things begin and end with God. So then you would say, well, what would I see? And that's why John uses the word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Because the term word is the expression, is the manifestation, is the picture, is the revelation, right, of what God wanted us to see. So it's not even that we would see God, but it is seeing what God wanted us to know and to see about Him. And that's important. So when we look at the Gospels and we study the Gospels, we're studying the revelation, what God wanted us to know and see in Jesus. So if you don't have the gospel revelation in your mind of Jesus, then you have man's revelation. And that is a problem. That is the problem. And so the only cure for that is to study. All right, so did a little background last time. We talked about the who Matthew is. Matthew was a tax collector. He was a Jewish tax collector, and for that reason he was outcast. He was hated because tax collectors were greedy, and you had to pay their taxes, and you had no recourse. So they were hated. They were also oftentimes immoral, because really, if you stop and think about the greed, remember Paul said that the love of money is the root excuse me, of all evil. And if you have the kind of greedy heart, if you have that kind of heart, that you could abuse people like that, then yeah, that you are going beyond. See, you're going beyond just it makes for a type of character of people. So all right, so verse 1, Matthew chapter 1. So Matthew, again, was the tax collector. We'll get into his story a little later. Other than he was what you could say one of the original apostles, which means at some point Jesus calls him. We'll see this in the story here later on, and he leaves his business, which kind of shows you the fruit of the impact of what that Jesus had on him. He left his business. He left a very lucrative business, and but he was one of the original apostles, which means he was an eyewitness. Remember, this is the gospel message. This is he was established as an apostle. Okay. Now, Matthew is telling his story, and I'm going to say this again because this is important. Matthew's gospel is, of all of the other gospels, the most Jewish. He is going to present Jesus as the son of Abraham, the son of David. The lineage was extremely important, that the Messiah had to come through a certain lineage. Now, for that reason, if you notice, before we get into it, he said Matthew immediately starts his gospel with that lineage. In other words, immediately he starts with the genealogy of Jesus, and to prove who Jesus is. So Jesus proves he's the Son of God through his miracles, you could say through his teachings, but also through his lineage. And this is very important right here. In other words, if it came out that Jesus was from the tribe of Naphtali, right, he would be a fake. Okay, so in other words, he had to come through that. But he had to come through the line of David. And this is what we're going to see. Now, genealogies is very interesting. Look at verse 1 again. The historic record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So right there, those two names, right, are extremely important. The Messiah had to come from this line, this lineage. A couple of things about genealogies. There are genealogies in the Bible, of course, if you read them, they do have a purpose. And there are some very interesting things about genealogy. So they're not all boring, and we're going to, even with this genealogy, there's a couple of interesting things about that. Here's one of the things about genealogies that I think people get is a misunderstanding. They try to establish sort of a timeline. Now, Matthew has a genealogy, Luke has a genealogy, and Luke's genealogy goes all the way back to Adam. Now, if you go to, I think it's Genesis chapter 6, I believe it is. No, 5 maybe. There's a genealogy. In First Chronicles is a long genealogy. And then also there's some genealogies throughout the Old Testament. There are several sets of genealogies. Okay, now when you get back in some of the Old Testament ones, they do get a little boring. Like in Genesis, there's some genealogies that clearly spells out the lineage of Isaac, and we're going to see that that's important here when we come to Abraham's list. Okay, his genealogy. So genealogies basically served two purposes. One, to establish firmly the bloodline of Jesus, going back through David, through Abraham, and the righteous line. Matthew doesn't do that, but going all the way back through Seth, not Cain, because Abel was killed, then Adam. For that reason, then the other reason is that then other genealogies pretty much show that they lead away from Jesus. They lead away from the Messiah. So here's a good. So, like for example, Islam will claim that they follow the bloodline of Ishmael. So Abraham's illegitimate son by the slave. They say that that's where their line came from. Now, and that's a lot of people accept that. Let me just say, I don't even know if that's all true, because what the genealogies clearly point out, and this is and the reason why you have an extensive genealogy on Ishmael is to show he is not the lineage of Isaac. He is not the promised child that God prophesied and spoke to Abraham. Okay, and by the way, there's nothing to indicate that Ishmael was the father of Islam. Okay, so and so also, if I butcher some of these names, forgive me. I'm not going to even try oftentimes to pronounce them as they are given. But so again, Matthew starts from Abraham. So verse 2 says, and by the way, again, look at verse 1, the historical record. And the reason why I want to emphasize that again is that the Gospels account is God's record. It's his record, not man. That's important. You look at biology. Now, this is just a good example right here. There's which is called authorized biology and unauthorized biology, and so you have people who are right, like even now, right? There are people who are writing things about, and they do this with every celebrity, but even like for example, our current president, right? There are writings on them. People are writing things, some good, some bad. Okay, so God wrote His own, and God Matthew's telling is God's account, and it's what He wanted us to know, and that's important. All right, so verse 2, he says, Abraham fathered Isaac, and you go back in Genesis, this was extremely important. It takes up from chapters 12 of Genesis, you see this storyline dominating. It dominates the Genesis narrative. So Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Now you'll note that he mentions Judah because this is the line. And then he says, yes, his brothers, but the emphasis here is on Judah. This is the bloodline. This is why we're talking about these genealogies. One other thing too about genealogies, I'm going to say this, that genealogies are not the best way to try to establish a timeline as far as the age of the earth. You see people saying, so when people say there is an argument out there of what is called young earth, old earth. The young earth will say that the earth was created about 6,000 years ago. Old earth, and I'm going to say heavily influenced by a lot of science and evolution, would say, okay, the earth goes millions of years. I'm not here to debate that because I'm not a scientist. In other words, I can't tell you based upon carbon dating and all of the stuff that scientists use. I'm not qualified to debate that. I will say this, it's not the point either. In other words, when you eventually we're going to end up in Genesis, and again we're going to explore that because the Genesis account was not designed to give a scientific or an archaeological account of creation. It was telling the story, and that's how you have to look at it. It's telling the story, and there are a lot of things that the writers didn't focus on. So, and we're going to see this in a moment, how that why genealogies are not reliable to establish a timeline of the earth. That's not what the purpose. The genealogies are reliable to tell the bloodline of Jesus, or who they want to tell the bloodline. In this case, it is Jesus. So he says Judah, verse 3, he says, Judah fathered Perez by Zerah by Tamar. Now, here's another interesting thing here. And by the way, when you go back and read Genesis, you'll see that Jacob's sons were some characters, okay? So how this story come about with Tamar, that Judah, around the time when Joseph was sold off into Egypt, Judah left the family. And he was living out, doing his thing, right? Not living his best life, but he comes across, he had went off and he got married. And the reason why I'm bringing this kind of story up, because it ties into the genealogy, how when you go back and you read the Genesis account, these brothers were scoundrels. The sons of the 12 sons of Jacob were scoundrels. And then over time, they did mellow out, but they were. So Judah goes off, and this is why you even have this story in Genesis, because remember, through Judah comes the Messiah, comes the Son of God. So Judah, he goes off and he gets married, and he has 3 sons. And the first son, the first two sons God kills because they were awful sons. Okay. So Judah was then worried that, okay, this third son, I want to protect him because I don't want him to die, right? Now, Tamar, and this, by the way, these were pagans. They were not the bloodline, and they certainly wasn't where God wanted Judah to go. And certainly with those two sons, all right, they die. And they have this one of the reasons why God killed one of them is that they have this custom. We don't even know where it comes from, but the custom is, if you have a family, you got sons, in order to, and every man was to keep his bloodline. That was extremely important, right? The bloodline. So, and as we see it here, Isaac begot, Jacob. That was important. So what would happen is that if one of the brothers or a man would die, they had this. Again, don't know where this custom come up with, but they had this custom. Well, then the brother would come up, sleep with the wife, and have a child in the brother's stead, and then he'd go back to his life. His line would go on. Okay. Well, Judah's son Onan didn't want that. So what he did was, when they was having sex, he pulled out, and God said, "No, I don't like that." Okay. Besides the fact that they were wicked guys. So when we come to the youngest child, his son, and Judah basically tells Tamar, wait till he grows up, and then I'm going to give him, to you as wife, and then you continue your bloodline. Except when he grows up, he doesn't give him, Judah doesn't give him to Tamar. So one day, Tamar said, okay, I'm being played. So she dresses up like a prostitute, and then she actually sleeps with Judah. And as they were going to stone her, because they was like, of course it was incredible. It was the hypocrisy was just unbelievable. And what saved Tamar from being burned to death was, she said, I'm pregnant by the man, and she had his staff and signet ring and stuff like that. But this is why I'm saying this is a very interesting story behind some of these. You go back and you can read them in Genesis. And another interesting thing is, because, and this goes back to the sinfulness of man. So as James Brown said, it's a man's world, right? But it was very, of course, extremely chauvinist, extremely. And women, they were just a step above slaves. So they didn't have rights, And the reason why I'm saying that is there are 4 women that are mentioned here in the bloodline. And that's unusual. 4 women, we're going to see, there's 4 women mentioned here in the bloodline, and that's very unusual. So Tamar is one of them, and not only that, she's a pagan, and we're going to see how many different. You can see that there were. I'm going to say, let me see, 1, 2, 3, maybe pagan women. So Tamar is one of them. So verse 3 again, Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Aram. Aram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nishan. Nishan fathered Salom. Salom fathered Boaz by Rahab. And then now right here is there's a gap in the timeline between Boaz and this is why I said genealogies are not that reliable as a strict timeline. Here's a nice gap. Okay, so it says Solomon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Okay, now Rahab was, when you come to you see here it is. Rahab was around Joshua, when Joshua went into the promised land, and she was a harlot, and that's ironic and not a story in and of itself. It had been 40 years that the children of Israel had been wandering in the wilderness, and so Joshua is now getting ready to seize the city of Jericho. They send out 2 spies. Rahab keeps these spies, and then and so when God gave them victory and they destroyed the city of Jericho, Rahab and her family was spared. Of course, the family was spared because excuse me, the Rahab. I mean, the family was spared because of Rahab. Now, when he says that Solomon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Rahab, this was the timeline is a lot further along right here, by about a couple of 100 years. So that's what I'm saying. There's not always the great indicator here. So anyway, Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Now again, Ruth was a Moabite. So right here you see the first 3 women who were not only were they pagan, they were pagan women in the bloodline, the direct bloodline of Jesus. So that's amazing when you think about these women. Ruth was a Moabitess. Let me show you that God has some very even specific. The Moabites was not even allowed into the congregation of Israelites. In general, the Israelites could not marry outside of the nation of Israel for the purpose of not polluting the bloodline. So it wasn't about race, but not polluting the bloodline. The exception to that was if someone came to faith, we would say, if someone embraced the God of Israel, and Ruth did. Ruth's story is very interesting, and her story falls in the line of the Judges. But again, so Ruth, notice this. So Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar are both pagan women in the direct bloodline of Jesus. So it says, Solomon fathered Boaz. Verse 5 again. Solomon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David. So you see that Ruth was David's great-great-great-grandmother. It says, then David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. So we see Bathsheba, she's not mentioned by name, but that's who Solomon's mother was, Bathsheba. And then Uriah, that story, of course, was one of David's blemish on his record. Uriah was one of David's 30 great men, and he killed them to cover his sin of the affair with Bathsheba. It says Solomon fathered Rehoboam. Rehoboam is a very interesting character. Again, you go back and you read Genesis, you will see all these stories right here. Rehoboam is the cause of the split. Reason why you had a northern and southern kingdom. The kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And if you see at this point, then he's not going to go with the kings and list the kings of Israel, but he's going to list just again coming down through the line of Judah. And that's why when you go to the Old Testament, you see this king. I mean, the stories, the kings of Israel, going back and forth between the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. Same thing with Chronicles. Chronicles, they go back and forth with the kings of Israel, because they were actually two separate nations at this time. It wasn't only just a civil war. That civil war, I put it like this: what the Confederacy had prayed that would happen happened in the time of Israel, that they had split and became two separate nations. When you read Chronicles, you're going to read Chronicles from the side emphasis on Judah, right? Because that's the bloodline of Christ. Okay, so Rehoboam, because of his foolishness, he kind of starts this here. It was a foolish act. Verse 7 again, Solomon fathered Rehoboam, and then Rehoboam fathered Abijah, and Abijah fathered Asa. Asa fathered Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat fathered Joram, and Joram fathered Uzziah. It says Uzziah fathered Jotham. Jotham fathered Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Hezekiah. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. And of course, we know the story about Hezekiah, the great king. His is a very interesting story. You go back and read, because even though he was the great king, he had a pride issue. One of the reasons why he was sick too, he had a pride issue. Manasseh is a very interesting story. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. Manasseh was by far the most wickedest king in Israel's history. So wicked that because of his actions, he actually sealed the doom. In other words, God said, because of Manasseh, there is no turning back. In other words, God had been warning prophetically, raising up prophets, warning prophetically for Israel to turn away from their sins. Manasseh was so wicked that God says, okay, no turning back. Your doom is sealed. Nebuchadnezzar's coming, Babylon's coming, and you're going to be destroyed. Okay? And that's all because of Manasseh. An interesting thing about Manasseh too, he was, like I said, by far the most wickedest thing. The bloodshed, everything. The contrast here was that Hezekiah was such a righteous king. The reforms, the times, and you would always see this going back and forth with Israel. When you read through, the kings of Israel and the Chronicles, and even starting from the judges, the judges going through Samuel, all that, it's always going back and forth. They would be good from one generation, then the next generation, they would just fall off and get in sin, sometimes get conquered. God would rescue them, restore them. Now Manasseh, Ahab, in the way God would even chart it, like he started like with Ahab, going back to Ahab. He would say that Ahab and he was the king of Israel, by the way. That's why you don't see him listed. But Jezebel was married to Ahab, but that was under the northern kingdom of Israel. But and God would say that you sin like Ahab. But Manasseh topped them all. He was so wicked, and finally he got conquered, and they put hooks in him and just dragged him off to jail. One of the most astounding things about his story was, while he was in jail, being afflicted, being treated horribly, and you can even say he deserved it, but he humbled himself before God, and God actually forgave him and he restored him. But God still said, but Babylon is still coming. Okay, so he said he's still, there's no coming back from that. All right. So, all right, verse 10 again. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. Manasseh fathered Amon fathered Josiah. Now, one interesting about Josiah. All right, okay, guys. So Facebook here is my Facebook is going out. But anyway, Josiah was prophesied by name some 200 years before he was born. Okay, so verse 11, and Josiah fathered Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile of Babylon. Now, if you remember, I said that the Babylon, this exile to Babylon was a turning point, not only in Israel's history, but also in the course of human events from this point on. It says, then after the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah fathered Shealtiel, and Shealtiel fathered Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is a very interesting person in that he is in prophecy. You see him in prophecy. So, and now it says Zerubbabel fathered Abihud fathered Eliakim, and Eliakim fathered Azar fathered Zadok fathered Akim fathered Elud fathered Eleazar fathered Mathan fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who was called the Messiah. All right. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick it up with the birth of Jesus tomorrow. But like I say, reading just the genealogies here, yes, they could be boring, but if you go back and you read kind of the story in the and all of this you follow in the Old Testament, their story becomes very, very interesting. So all right, guys, we're gonna pick it up again at the birth of Jesus next time. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I'll see you in the next study. All right.